This is exactly what I thought was going to happen. I knew I shouldn't have come on here. Oh my God.
Welcome to the N1 Experience, brought to you by N1 Education, the leader in fitness education.
Probably a surprise to some of you guys today, but today on the podcast, we have hypertrophy coach Joe Bennet, somebody that I've known probably a lot longer than many of you guys may realize, if you even
Yeah.
know that we know each other.
hmm
So I think the best place to start, Joe, is actually just when we met, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but it was like the first time we met, the trip that I came down to Sarasota and we like did your biosig, or I can't remember.
No, we definitely met before that because it's honestly the first time we met, although I don't remember the course, is I know that we actually took at least one Falkland course together. So I think you might have taken like, did you take the PIMS one in like Rhode Island, I think, or something, maybe?
I took almost every course
Yeah, I
in
know you
Rhode
did.
Island,
Yeah.
so this,
Yeah. So I think I took at least two there. I'm pretty sure we actually took one of those courses together. And it was one of those things where I don't think I like connected the dots till afterwards because I don't know what remember stuck out, but I remember like you had Ryan, I think was like, or was it either Ryan or Derek was like doing your programming at the time or something. And I remember you guys having a dialogue about that in front of me, maybe. And that's, I remember connecting dots. I was like, I'm pretty sure that was Kassem in the same class as me. So I took at least two at Rhode Island and I probably took eight altogether. And no, we met because we met in, well, maybe it wasn't, I think it was before Sarasota because I think I met one time when you were coming to visit Ben.
yeah,
So
at
yeah.
Powerhouse maybe.
Yeah, I'll give everybody a little background. You can fill in the dots wherever I left something out, but it's so everybody doesn't know I first connected with Ben. I just met him randomly at some gym and invited myself to train with him. And then we just started training. If anybody doesn't know Ben, like the first bunch of times you trained together, it was just like Ben Pekulski, if anybody doesn't know what I'm talking about. It's basically a bullying session, which Kassem's well familiar with. And so like the first bunch of times I trained with him, he was just literally beating the shit out of me and I didn't really know how much his whole like psychological thing, which is awesome in retrospect, is like to beat the shit out of you and him acting like nothing's going on whatsoever. But also he would whoever was training with him would go like 12 working sets past failure, and then he'd do like three working sets to failure. But that's neither here nor there. So I remember at first I was doing his biosigs for him, and then I was like sending all the information. He was sending it all to you, and that's when I first like he was like, "Oh, I got this guy Kassem helping me out with all this stuff." And then I think we met at some point in time when you came and you were just staying for a short duration, but then we connected at some point in time, obviously the most in Sarasota where Tom came and taught a little RTS, whatever it was, a couple weeks down there. And yeah, that was the original.
Yeah, so I think that the first time we really spent time together was at the RTS courses. But it's interesting, I don't recall us meeting at a Poliquin course, but it could have been one of those things where we were in the same space, but just didn't really
Oh yeah.
cross. We were both basically too busy sniffing Charles's nuts to notice anybody
Yeah.
else in
Yeah,
the room at
exactly.
that point in
Yep.
time. Yeah.
Being mystified by everything that he was doing, especially the PIM stuff, poking stuff and
Yeah.
people turning coming to life and stuff. Yeah.
hmm and then, so from there, like I decided to move down to Tampa because Ben wanted to open a gym. I was actually looking at opening a place in Iowa myself with another guy, and Ben basically convinced me to not do that, come to Florida, and that's where all that Strive equipment came from. This is I was originally
Yeah.
looking at that for the Iowa gym, and wasn't wasn't shortly after that, probably about 6 months because it was a delayed. And
Mhm.
then you moved up to Tampa as well. Like basically, as soon as we got equipment in the building, I think at the
Yeah.
new place.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact. The same thing, obviously, with everything with Ben was, I kind of just trying to figure out when should I come, when should I come, and then finally be like, all right, I'm going to come and pull the trigger. And then
Mm.
once you're up there, you're like, should I have come yet? I don't know. But yeah, no, that was definitely. And I remember obviously coming out putting equipment together. I remember when I smashed your finger one time or something trying to assemble some equipment.
Oh yeah, that was the point in time I was like, okay, don't let Joe have power tools. Like
Yeah, yeah.
he's that kind of meathead where it's okay, he can look strong, but like when we need to do some shit here, don't let
Just
him
don't
be
be
in
near me.
control of anything that
They just put me outside to grind all the plates by myself. He can
yeah.
only hurt himself out there.
Yeah. I'm sure all the dust and stuff was good for you,
Yeah, exactly.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably not the heavy metal that most people need in
No,
there.
no.
I'm curious what some of the most like interesting moments or things that we did in that period because you had come up and trained with Ben at Powerhouse when I was there before we opened, and we were doing things like the quote unquote the Bayesian curls and a lot of the stuff. We were trying to apply some of the things from RTS, doing the stepped back hammer rows and stuff like that. So I'm curious what your We'll say, what are the things that you think stood out, like that we are like playing around with early that
Yeah.
are either were significant in your thought process or they're like still things that you're like really applying now?
Yeah. Yeah, well, honestly, just to give everybody some background too, and I'll go into this for everyone still like, why the hell is Joe talking to Kassem right now? Honestly, I thought all of it in the beginning, I'm sure you were like all of it was exciting, right? Like even like the whole like, getting together and doing stuff with Ben and going into Tampa and like even just trying to get shit together and make the gym work. I literally had like savings that I burned through like the first 6 months that we moved up there when we basically weren't making any money. But it was awesome. And so honestly, if Sherman doesn't know between Cass and I, some of the things that I figured I'd share would be a good. I was thinking of like, what are some things that we can talk about getting on here as well too? Like I think one, I think you're the only person that's ever done anything for my diet when I was prepping ever because you did like my whole last week in the southern states. So you're the only person I've ever let do my diet, which was great at that point in time because I think it's even though remember we were trying to get some water off of me at the end and that didn't work, but there's still the fact that you had me do a carb load and a fat load. That's probably the best I ever looked up until that point in time, like actually coming
Yeah.
into a show full, looking good. But so for everybody that doesn't know like the whole background with everything we'll get into now, like as soon as like I met up with Cass, I was like, oh sweet, this dude's really smart. Helped me a ton with supplements, helped me a ton with nutrition, helped my wife a ton with supplements and nutrition. When we were the whole time when you're first meeting Carol, I don't even know if you met Carol before she was ever pregnant. But basically the whole time you knew Carol was either like having a baby or pregnant, having a baby. Cass like helped out a ton with she was like nauseous the whole time. So Cass was like trying to get everything out of his playbook he possibly could. Try this, try that. And so anyway, honestly, all of it, our relationship, especially in the beginning, was great the whole time through. Like the end, everything just kind of got, it was a high pressure, not super fun situation. But honestly, all of it was great. So I remember standing out, just being happy to have you and Ben, obviously, as resources and people that I could actually count on for feedback and valued information. I think you're one of the only people I've ever let train me, actually, or you take me through a workout, and I don't think at all. Because even now, like, I can't tolerate most people training me. And it's not obviously, I'm sure the same as you. It's not like an ego thing, but it's like, I don't want someone that's like, hey, we're going to do 10 sets of 10. I'm going to make you vomit and shit your pants. I'm like, that's not
Yeah.
hard. At the same time, I don't want someone that's going to be like, squeeze. And have you ever tried this angle? And I'm like, yes, I'm aware of that angle, whatever that angle is. But anyway, no, it's great times. And to speak to our interaction with RTS and being there with Ben and people were coming through, it was just, the stand, I guess, it was an awesome time to be around people that liked thinking about stuff and experimenting while at the same time not getting so like balls deep into the nerd stuff that we didn't stop training at any point, which I guess was a hallmark. If I think of everything up there, it's like, everything with Tom, is definitely one of the first people that really had me start thinking about profiles and, really understanding everything that goes in, like, what is your body capable of doing? Why is that probably really important? If we're just trying to, have max force production, if we're going through a range of motion. But then all of it still is like anybody that doesn't know Tom's background, like he's a retired meathead and just works with like broken people now, essentially. So it was awesome. I mean, all of it was just like, kind of all of that happening at the same time of us training together, training people, just thinking, training hard. It was good. Like everything, like that's kind of the standout, I guess, is like compared to even how things tend to go now is, there's a lot of extremes. And I think there was actually still like a pretty good balance, and obviously the nicest, the whole throwing in the whole time is like Ben at any point in time being 6 weeks out is when you get the idea of like, hey, I want to try this thing. Ben's like, fuck you, tell me after prep. And just like, no, I need to train. I need to do whatever. And honestly, that's like nice. You realize too, like the context a lot of people have now is like there's a million times where smart things are great, and there's a million times where they might not be applicable or apply. And then the whole thing too is like, when the hell do you apply stuff to actual clients? It's like very clear that people have never trained with clients. Like if you have a client that hates something or it pisses them off or they don't like it, like I don't care how many studies you can cite on it, you'll never do that with that client ever, or you're the worst client or the worst trainer ever. So it was great. And honestly, I think about that time for everybody doesn't know. I say this all the time when I'm looking at all the crap that's out there now. It's like people don't realize how much stuff stemmed from that place, where like there's a lot of stuff, honestly, from a profile standpoint, where the way people use and misuse the words profiles and don't actually differentiate like strength profiles and resistance profiles, like how much stuff. I even joke too, is from my memory, not that he obviously invented this word, but Tom was one of the first people to use like the adjective like optimal, just when you're saying, hey, if we're going to have an aim for something, like why wouldn't you aim for optimal? And like now that's like there's 18-year-olds that have just completely bastardized that term and turned it into something that was never, what it was intended to be. But I think about how much stuff we were doing and how much stuff started out of that place where I feel like that really was the start of a lot of things that have kind of gone all over the place now.
Mhm.
Yeah, I guess that's my brief rundown in history is it was honestly most of it's like 90% of the time there was awesome doing all of those things that again for anybody that's not familiar, it was a good time.
Yeah. It, if it wouldn't have been for, we'll say the terrible business environment, financial aspect or whatever, I would say that especially early on before we realized how much of a shit show that was going to be, was it was probably one of the most fun times in my career because I don't think I've ever actually just spent that much time like just trying new stuff and
Oh yeah.
experimenting and having people around that you could bounce ideas off of, having a place where literally we could like tinker around with the equipment and do all sorts of stuff that you would be thrown out of a public gym for,
Yeah.
which is still like one of the biggest critiques. Anytime I try something in my own private space, somebody's, oh, again, I'm like, I'm just showing you an idea here. I'm not
Yeah.
telling you that you need to do this at 5 o'clock at Crunch Fitness or whatever it is. So I think if I just were to list off some of the stuff that for reference for people of, man, these are the things, and obviously I don't like to use the word invented because you never know when somebody did stuff, but everything from like simple stuff like putting blocks underneath the hammer strength machines so that you
Yeah.
could get in there without a shoulder press or without having to get your shoulders like in some awkward position, to doing all sorts of different like Bayesian curls and the katana style raises and stuff like that, your lying lateral raise, stepped back hammer rows, basically the innovation of foot plates and heel elevations. A lot of that like started there. And I don't think a lot of people realize that because this was right, like none of us were really active on social until I didn't get active until I pretty much left. You weren't active until you started Hypertrophy Coach. So during this period, we
Yeah.
weren't really filming or posting much of this stuff.
Yeah.
It was like only a select few people knew it, and then it grew organically
Yeah.
from that group of people rather than coming from us originally, I
Yeah.
think. Even
Hmm.
something like recently that went viral was, do you remember the tricep extensions where basically we use the cuff as like a counterforce, you know?
You're definitely the first person I saw do that.
Yeah. So apparently those are like making the rounds again.
Yeah.
But now, unfortunately, it's on TikTok and it's people with
Uh,
11-inch arms. So
yeah.
they're only using a
You don't need
quarter
to
of the
brace,
cuff.
man. Yeah. Yeah. And you have nothing to brace for, right?
I'm curious how you have evolved from the place of our departure because we haven't sat down and talked shop since we went our separate ways. So I'm curious if you can draw a line at somewhere around like 2018-ish. Give me the summary of what you've been doing in terms of evolving your ideas and training practices. What do you think that what would be different or
Yeah.
interesting to me that I don't know about?
Man, that's a tough question. I don't know if I have anything that's going to be interesting to you. No, no. I mean, honestly, some of it, because, big shift for me was like that's right about the time that like I stopped competing, so that was kind of a part of it as well, too. I was originally going to stop competing right after I did Tampa because everything happened with Dallas after that. And then I got talked into one more time just doing nationals with Hunter because like that's when Hunter was like, and he did turn pro. And I was like, oh, that'll be a fun experience. I'll do that one more time. And so that was kind of a shift, obviously. That's just like, not even the whole competing aspect, but like at that point in time was like one, like, all right, I'm not going to try and like get huge the rest of my life. Like just, from age 15, I'm like, I'm just going to try and get as big as possible. And then at some point in time, you're like, I can't do that forever. So that I think it was actually a good part for me to shift more towards, that's when I probably started doing even like more content concerned with like, oh, what are other people have going on? And obviously more with like the people that I was training still at that point in time. But honestly, if there's one thing that I've spent more time and effort on anything, if I had to have all encompassing, and we can get into some nitty gritty if I've had little shifts here and there with other stuff, but it's just my communication. I mean, I probably put more time and effort into how I communicate information, like one, especially online, but with clients and like creating context and application and like the nuance around it, because you kind of have to now, unless you want to be like every other idiot out there that just either says you're with me and I'm amazing, or you're against me and you suck and you're a horrible human being, you should go to hell. When you train, like when you actually train people, it's just the way you view the things that you use, the tools you use, and like the context of when you use them. Like almost nothing is like that. And like I said before, there could be something that's great, but if I had a client that was just like, I hate that or whatever, even if it was just something like emotional, they're like, oh, too much time in setup, it's a pain in the ass, I'm never gonna do that. I would move on in like half a second. I'd be like, okay, cool. Here's the other thing that you can do where I totally get it. So from a nuts and bolts things, I don't know if there's good information that I feel like has shifted maybe the way I've looked at stuff a little bit is, the notion, and again, probably none of this is that exciting or new to you, but just even the shift a little bit of looking at like maybe recovery a little bit more from how we used to look at it, like especially 20, 15 years ago, where it was much more literally like recovery. You think it's like all like structural stuff where it's like we're, tearing muscle and we need to build it back up or whatever. And just a little bit more of the shift to, more fatigue management, although everyone's turned that into something absolutely horrible now as well, too. that's probably some of it. I like a lot of the stuff, and I probably like it because of my bias that I think, Chris Beardsley put out, circa 2018, 19 with his like the stimulating rep model, whatever. And obviously he's a guy of anyone that's really balls deep into like research and physiology stuff. I like the way he generally puts stuff together where it's much more for the most part, trend based, where it's like, hey, here's this big body of stuff and here's this trend of things, as opposed to just like, again, drawing lines in the sand with stuff. So, I think I'm maybe attempting to have a better idea of like, what really leads to hypertrophies from a stimulus standpoint, and maybe a better way to like quantify that. It's just opposed to like, back in the day, even if I'm thinking back in the day, like bodybuilding stuff, when I'm first trying to navigate things, it's like, oh, like just do Arnold stuff. Like everything's like 5 sets of 12. And I'm like, how the hell do I navigate that from a progression standpoint? So I think he's done some good stuff where, again, not that he invented it, but having some good use for things of like, okay, where do we look at like failure reps? Where do we look with like reps in reserve? How do we actually quantify maybe effective volume a little bit better? And then maybe understanding some of the underlying mechanisms of that a little bit better. So, yeah, I don't know. And I guess the only other thing that's maybe shift or evolved, a little bit just the more I work with, more especially like older broken people, which again, I did a lot of that when I was young and had no idea what I was doing. And then now kind of shifting back and just doing a little bit of that kind of here and there for fun as well too. It's just realizing, how much being aware of like orthopedic tolerance is like, pretty much almost everything that supersedes everything else. If we're like going to argue, that's the whole thing everyone wants to argue about, like, specific bicep or tricep movements or whatever. And the reality is like, not to say that there aren't things that are probably inherently slightly better than others, but if it's like, hey man, you find something that's like elbow healthy, that's the kind of stuff that I think makes the biggest difference from a training standpoint. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely subtle shifts of things here and there. I don't know if there's one like big glaring thing that I'd be like, aha, you know what I mean? But I'm sure
Mhm.
maybe as we get into it, there'll be some things that we can, maybe, like I said, get into the specifics a little bit more. But
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest shifts for me was, and this kind of happened around the last yearish that I was at MI40 actually, was we were very Q heavy for a while. So we kind of got into the intention space when
yeah.
we were doing the muscle camps and whatnot. We were very focused on cues. And I basically flipped to like try to fix as much as you can with just the setup and not using cues, and basically let the setup be the cue. And I think that was one of the first big shifts was rather than trying to depend on these people trying to interpret the instruction, what if I can just set up the exercise better so that the exercise is the feedback for them to do it right? And so basically, I think one of the first shifts was is like, all right, it went from very cue heavy to actually let's talk a lot more detail on how to individualize setup so that we can use the fewest amount of cues possible. But in
Yeah.
doing that, like basically in terms of the mechanic side of things, had to get significantly more detailed, not from a resistance profile perspective, but more of the human mechanics side of it, so
Mhm.
that you could individualize an arm angle, a trunk position, etc., more specifically, so that basically it's like, okay, now I don't have to tell them how to move, how to try and push through their elbow or whatever, because I've basically set up the exercise. So that's just the, we'll say, intuitive or natural thing to do. And I think that was kind of like the biggest philosophical change that we did initially. And I don't know if you still like to use a lot of queuing or if you have reduced that kind of from our muscle camp days.
Yeah. I think it depends a lot on the demographic. I enjoy that balance and respect whatever different coaches bring to the table for that for sure. But I definitely think, especially when some of it's like the camps is like one is a short period of time when it's like you have this like people are jumping in. I think we just kind of like all of a sudden you got all, how we had it set up. We got all these people going around and it's like we're all trying to give 27 different cues. It's such a far cry too from I'm sure what you would do if you had somebody one-on-one anyway. Like, hey, Cash, you got this
Hmm.
person like 4 times a week for the next 12 weeks. Because honestly, like I shifted a lot of stuff and I don't regret it, but I shifted a lot of stuff like coming and working purely in that environment opposed to like I'd never like I'd done group like training trainers before, but I'd never done like any style of group training like people coming like seminars before. And so yeah, it could just you kind of just get in the way of like, hey, we're doing all this stuff where it's like, with a normal person, even someone that's more for like muscle building, I would literally never give them anything internal ever. It's like it's almost like, okay, I'm just gonna put you in the positions where we're trying to like basically almost like damage control, like what are we going to do where it's again in today's session, who knows exactly how it's going to go? And I'm sure you've got more specific things going on from an equipment standpoint where maybe you look into it even more in depth than I am of setting things up even more. But if I have somebody, it's just like, okay, it's all pretty much all positions to start. It's like, okay, like where can I get you and doing some things? And then again, depending on the positions, from there, depending on the person, I might give them some internal stuff to think about. And the way that I've always framed that is I don't ever want to put, I mean, for sure, if you definitely had to like lump a scale one way or the other, putting someone in the right positions is definitely the right place to start with because you can, I mean, you and I have seen it, especially again, because some of the nerds in a nice way that I say that we attract is you'll have someone like, you'll look at them training and like everything's just cue focused where you're like looking at their bodies in all sorts of crazy positions, but they've contorted themselves to be able to squeeze and feel something astronomically. And I'm just like, okay, well, that's not the point of potentially the squeezy thing. But that was someone else's thing more than ours was like the whole squeeze it like it owes you money, which I think the pure intention thing taken out of context can be one of the worst cues to people, like literally just saying squeeze things as hard as you can squeeze. Because I'm sure you've seen it's basically people just turning in like an isometric battle with themselves. Like, how much can I
Hmm.
fight my biceps, fight my triceps, or whatever. And then honestly, the thing that bothers me the most with it's all like the way my brain works, and this is something I actually shifted a little bit from Ben. And again, not in a negative way, but like I'm so quantitative, especially from training. Like prior to training with Ben, it was like I was much lower volume with things, and like every single thing I always documented and wrote down or whatever. And then obviously you train with Ben. It was like that was the first time like, oh my gosh, we're doing like 3 or 4 legit working sets of like these horribly huge movements. And I have people looking back at some of our own videos. I don't even know where they exist. Be like, why did you that one chest workout you did with Ben? You did like 8 working sets on like the Smith. And I'm like, I don't know, it was fun. And I'm like, again, I don't regret it because who cares? But anyway, so that's kind of a little bit slightly off topic. But yeah, when you do the pure intention, the pure squeezy thing, obviously you totally lose all of that. I've heard people say like, "Oh, why would you even care about weight if you can just make this as hard as you can with squeezing?" And I was like, "Well, you have like a squeezy scale then every week. Like this week, I was like a 9.4 on the squeezy scale. Better go to 9.5 next week, and like writing that in there in your document, whatever." But so again, I mean, I tend to like again, this is a perfect example, I guess, of communication. Like when I'm working with somebody now, especially depending on what body part or what we're doing, I really try and like frame stuff with like, all right, well, let's see if this helps. And I'll even tell people like before a session now, like more, I've gone more the direction. I'll ask people because I still work with obviously a lot of like big meatheads that'll, you got a day with them, or you got 3 days with them and they'll come in and I'll ask them, I was like, you want me to just take what you're currently doing and let's just go through that together and see where either we can fine tune or maybe I'll say, hey, this really doesn't seem to fit. Maybe this would be a better option. Or I'll say, do you want me to just completely like take you through some stuff? People are like, oh, I want you to just take me through whatever. Okay. But a lot of people now it's more like take me through what you're going through. And I'll always frame stuff. I was like, man, if we go through a whole session and like 9 out of 10 things aren't that helpful, but one thing's really useful. And I'm like, good, hang on to that one thing. Remember me fondly. Forget the other nine, whatever. And so like that's especially with like those internal cueing things. Like if I can give somebody something that helps and they already have the framework of they're not doing things like a ding dong and like their positions and everything are pretty good, that's where I think it can have value. But yeah, it can definitely go really, really far the other direction really quick. And it's, again, it depends on the individual. You know what I mean? I think that's in our balance of nerd and meathead so much of the nerd stuff works well when applied to meatheads, where it's like the nerds, if you give them more nerd stuff, that's already favoring like where they have issues already. You need to like teach them how to be a little bit more of a meathead. Very individual, I think, context dependent a little bit there as well too.
Hmm. So the other thing that I think I would say probably my thought process has evolved a lot in is probably outside of just like improving the understand of anatomy and biomechanics, which that's a rabbit hole we won't go down. The way I'm looking at resistance profiles and challenges,
Hmm.
um, I think if we look at what we have with the research now and application, you can look at this through the lens of, okay, do I try and get the perfect profile, or do I try and get different exercises that basically suit different portions of the profile? And then also there's the how do I actually look at how this resistance challenge is for a person? And basically, I use resistance challenge as the relationship between the strength and resistance profiles. I think that's somewhat ubiquitous across
Hmm.
the space right now, but just for clarification, like right now, I use a very practical way of looking at evaluating a resistance challenge for a person where instead of trying to think about the internal and external moment arms and stuff, what we do is we look at actually how somebody approaches failure or how many partials they could get and things like that. Basically, if something's challenging in the short position,
Yeah.
The way you're going to reach failure is it's going to end up being like a very grindy-ish finish.
Hmm.
And then you're going to be able to do like a partial that's like a three-quarter rep and then
Yeah.
a half a rep or whatever. Whereas if something's really lengthened bias,
Hmm.
basically you almost run into a wall. Like
Yeah.
you get your last full rep and then maybe you get like this quarter, like little
Yeah.
nudge thing or something like that. And so that's how we look at it now. Okay, if we really want to evaluate an exercise, because there's so many factors in terms of different leverages, different attachment points, machine's got a million things going on. We got inertia, momentum. What we're leaning towards is what I just called as like a fuck around and find out approach. Basically,
Yeah.
it's like, all right, if you want to know how this person is experiencing a resistance challenge,
Hmm.
just do the set and the rep range that you want and either look how they fail
Yep.
or do a test where you try and apply partials at the end of that. And that then tells you, like, hey, for this person using that tempo, that intensity range, everything, that's the most accurate lens that you can get.
Hmm.
And then you use your physics knowledge to adjust the exercise if you can,
Yeah.
not the way that you want it. I've looked at a very practical
Hmm.
way of evaluating exercises and
Yeah.
then using the principled knowledge just to make adjustments from there. But I've gotten away from telling people, like, hey, don't sit down and try and analyze the machine.
Hmm.
Like, if you have
Oh
it,
yeah.
simply just pull on the handle
Yeah.
and let your body do the math itself. And
Mhm.
then obviously,
Yep.
if you're training clients online or whatever and you don't know, so just have them film a set, like literally going to failure, and then have them try partials.
Hmm.
That's the data that you need. You don't need to try and find all of the linkages and everything. Just
Hmm.
just
Yeah.
go from there. But it's interesting where we're at with research because you got the stuff on, oh, are lengthen based exercises better? Are they
Hmm.
only better if it's also a lengthen challenge?
Hmm.
Are they not really better, but it's just the regional hypertrophy difference that
Hmm.
we're seeing and how many different things? So we have a couple different studies now on resistance challenge, and actually Jeremy Etier is doing one using prime equipment comparing the short position versus the length of position overload that
Hmm.
hopefully we get those results by sometime this summer.
Yeah.
But it's okay, there seems to be clear utility to challenging a muscle at like having the peak challenge be at different places
Hmm.
versus there just being, hey, one way to do it. And so my philosophy is, well, if you could only do one exercise, which is an unreasonable
Yeah.
situation, it's like, all right, we could talk about what that profile might be. But
Hmm.
for most people, it's what you probably need is, if you have the volume, is to
Hmm.
start filling that stuff up with different things. But I sit where for hypertrophy, I'm thinking like, all right, if we're all out hypertrophy, I'm going about 70% focusing on like the mid to lengthen position and
Hmm.
maybe 30% on the mid to short stuff.
Yeah.
So basically, I'm biasing more of my volume towards that and
Hmm.
then filling in some with the short. And
Yeah.
then when I'm actually trying to, maybe somebody's in prep or focusing on a little bit more of a metabolic or conditioning goal, I'll
Hmm.
flip that and maybe it's 70-30 the other direction is a fatigue management strategy, maybe focusing a little bit more on nutrient partitioning stuff, following the physiology stuff that I was teaching at the level 2 course back
Hmm.
at MI40, but just a little bit more nuanced application. So I'm curious kind of what is the short version of how you're looking at applying resistance challenge to an athlete and kind of do you bias one way or another?
Dude, I think it's hilarious. So if anybody doesn't know, honestly, not at this point, I think just out of sheer habit, we don't see each other's content. And honestly, I literally have it written in somewhere. Like, I don't know the term that I use, but I have people ask all the time, like, well, how do you know? Like, if you're going to put a band on something, you're going to do whatever. And I literally have written somewhere else, like, if you want to have any idea of your profiles, you literally just do like your failure rep. And I said, like, failure rep test is like kind of as you approach failure, what happens? And I literally kind of use like the exact same context you just did perfectly. Because again, I've never been my whole thing to a certain degree. I don't want to say my whole new thing, my whole thing. Who knows what the hell I've had said exactly at some point in time or emphasized. But like if for, picking exercises and profiles, like from just an overall view, first goal is, the opposite's probably not a good idea, right? So if like we have a rowing thing and you can choose something that literally technically not only is to just even load the whole time like a dumbbell row, but if you actually had something that got heavier as you pulled to the short, or would you have something that gets lighter as you pull the short? If I'm going to pick those two, it's like 99% of the time I'm going to pick the other one because like that's like from a mechanics standpoint is like the complete opposite maybe of what you would want. But in general, like I said, if someone has a question about it, I'm like, okay, well, the failure rep speed is basically probably one, not failure rep speed, but even failure rep points is probably the best point. If you fail at this point, then you know the short was too heavy. So make adjustments where you can make it, or that's how you would do bands if you're banding something. And pretty much verbatim what you said for where I'm biasing more of my training volume. I literally say mid to lengthen range is where I typically bias more. If someone's only going to choose one, it's like for me, if I had to have someone choose, like, okay, in my program, I'm only going to have one quad movement. Is it going to be a squat pattern or a leg extension? I'd say, well, I'd rather have you do a squat pattern. Personally, for me, that's what I would pick. And you said from all practical purposes, like 99% of the time people can just do more than one exercise, so it's almost like a stupid argument anyway. Honestly, I'd say the only thing that I don't do that you do is like really changing as someone's going through prep, and not that I think there's anything wrong with that, but that's generally if I'm going to manage like fatigue, I tend to do it, with other variables, maybe between
Hmm.
lowering volume, proximity to failure, things like that. But like I said, I just view that more as coaching preference as opposed to
Hmm.
feeling if there's really something that's definitively right or wrong. But yeah, pretty much everything that you said is kind of how I look at most of that stuff. And honestly, even from like my gym equipment standpoint, where it's like it's basically like I'm sure I'm not modifying things remotely as much as you are. Maybe a couple little things here and there, but like even the stuff that I have is like I just get stuff that's pretty darn good. And I'm like, all right, cool. That's
Hmm.
that. Like I don't go too crazy trying to do stuff like perfect. I'm not like welding anything or anything at this point in time. Like literally like my seated leg curl is like a Life Fitness. I'm sure you probably use I want to say it's like Series 2, which has a pretty damn good profile on it already. Like it drops off, I don't remember, I've done the percentage at some point, but pretty significantly. So I'm like, yeah, it's good for me. It's not like something I just don't want something that's a circle or obviously the other way shaped egg like a ding dong or something. But so anyway, yeah, I mean I would say my view on profile stuff is pretty similar. Like if I'm going to pick an exercise and I'm going to do one, I'm going to try and do something that generally, again, with a rare exception, I'm sure like for rare body parts, does it really change that you're actually significantly stronger in the short? But I'm going to do stuff that maybe biases like the mid to lengthened ish. And then if from a programming standpoint, you can kind of train everything. And then there's obviously exceptions for like, well, why would I choose this exercise? It seems to only challenge the short, which might be for, again, other reasons outside of just what's the perfect profile reason?
Yeah. I think when people they learn how to calculate a moment arm and they're looking through that lens, I think a lot of people don't realize how different that static calculation can be once we're in the train. It doesn't take that much speed or acceleration to invert the resistance challenge of a dumbbell lateral raise. It doesn't
Hmm.
have to be this weird, awkward body flinging thing to get that. And I think that's one of the things where actually having a lab set up where we can measure these things has been really cool because we can look at, all right, what actually is the tempo threshold where I can take something that, like, so I can take like my pull down, my prime pull down, and put all the plates on the two pin to
Hmm.
overload the short position. And I can actually test like at what kind of contract or like degree of acceleration do I actually start to flatten or even flip that curve, even though
Yeah.
the plates, like if I measure the torque is one, but the
Yep.
inertial properties basically override the torque.
Yep.
And it's a lot less than what people think, especially on free weight machines or plate loaded machines where you basically get that huge displacement. You get a lot more momentum, there's more inertia, right? On cables and stuff, okay, it's a little bit less because we don't have the same amount of momentum and inertia to deal with, but I think that's one of the reasons I really like the practical approach too, is because a lot of people will be like, okay, I'm just going to do this with my profiles, but they're basing it off the static profiles. And I think that's probably, this is a good lead into the neuromechanical matching thing. I think that's probably one of the biggest areas where people misapply this information. They will look at an exercise, they will look at the static torque profile of that,
Hmm.
or they'll look at the muscles leverages and won't account for any of the other things that are affecting torque beyond the
Hmm.
moment arm. And then they base their exercise selection off of that and ignore the actual experience in the gym
Yeah.
of like where this is hard or whatnot. So that I can know where you are, why don't you start the conversation on neuromechanical matching, what you're seeing and what your thoughts are on about it, and then I'll try
Yeah.
and build from there.
Yeah. Honestly, I would say too, like one of the first people I've seen do that. I'm sure you're measuring accurately on everything, obviously, but it's literally like Tom had a demonstration I've seen at some point in time, literally just attaching like a game scale to a dumbbell. And like you
Mhm.
said, like it's literally insane like what you would think is like, hey, do good form. And like even with most people is good form, it's like, holy shit, like if you're actually looking at, what you're actually getting from a force standpoint at different ranges of motion. And then if you do form where it's like, hey, do like something like the average person in the gym, just like you said. So it is, I don't think people, like you said, realize what inertia can do to an exercise. And like you said, it's pretty wild. Yeah, but so for the neuromechanical matching thing, so one, as an interesting note, the thing that's most interesting for me with any of that stuff is the methodology of how they do the measurements and stuff. And so I actually have a call scheduled with what the guy, everybody that does, his studies the most, Auckland, Professor Auckland, the
Hmm.
guy that's in, yeah. And because the things I think I want to talk about to him about probably aren't the same stuff that a lot of other people do. My initial thoughts on any normal person and even most educators being concerned with internal moment arms is I can't think of a more useless variable for most people to think about. And I think a lot of it is, again, it's not, I love it. I think it's super interesting. But I think like the broad stroke before even getting into the detail stuff is it's almost like for me, it's like especially with people, the way they look at it too, from like a what does your body choose to use standpoint, it's almost like what came first, like the chicken or the egg type thing, where they're trying to say, okay, it's like if we have, I'm trying to flex my elbow, your body's gonna be like, oh, which one has the biggest moment arm and pick or whatever it is. And for me, it's more like, okay, well, from a pure physics logic standpoint, if you're trying to flex your elbow at maximum force, your body's going to use everything that it has capable of flexing your elbow. And then from there, you can actually look at internal moment arms and say, okay, well, in theory, what's responsible for this external expression of force. Whereas I don't think I've seen some information where people are like, at this point, this elbow flexor, at this point, this elbow flexor, and getting to the point where they're making training adjustments based off of what's working, what more. And I'm like, just in that train of thought, at what actual degrees does your body turn off, or what percentages does it? I'm going to turn off this. So it's like right as it crosses over, where this one's more bicep and this one's more brachialis. Like, where does it actually say? It's like as soon as one's one more, you're going to tell me it like turns the other one off. This one's got like a slightly larger, and then this one's like you'd have to literally draw a line in the sand where your body's like, that's not efficient. I'm not going to use that anymore. So I don't, I think it's again, it's interesting, and there are places in the body where I think having some idea of those like gets more interesting. Like if someone's like, hey, why the hell are glutes like so strong in the short position? Like that's one of the few areas in the body I think is interesting if you understand internal moment arms is like, oh, well, this is why this can be great in this position to bias here because that is such a significant difference from literally a large internal moment arm compared to something that essentially drops to nothing, like an adductor. Like that huge discrepancy, I think clarifies, okay, like this could be the reason for some training decisions of, in this range as opposed to that, if we're trying to not have that work in this work. But the way that some people are looking at it, and again, really just looking purely from like, where should I train or what range of motion should I train? And especially trying to bias different things, I think is a little useless. And that's not even taking into the context, like you said, of like, well, how is the person performing it? Like, so all of
Hmm.
those things, even from that standpoint. And I honestly think, I don't know, fan's not the right word, but people trying to understand. I mean, because you get in the realm of physics where people are like trying to reference a study and then like lose basic physics. Where this is something that I think is interesting is when people look at, when I was first looking at some of this stuff, and especially the older things, you'd read something on like the delt's internal moment arm, and it would literally say like the delt. And then I'd be like, well, how the hell are they determined? Like this is when you get people that say like, oh, like an overhead press is great for side delts, and that's all you need. And I was like, how could you, possibly say that if you're just saying like what's working at the most or whatever? And then actually you look further in research when they figured out like, oh, we can't just have one line of action for the delt because of its broad origin. And then in later research, it changed it to here's the line of action for the front delt, for the side delt, for the rear delt or whatever terms you want to use for the different heads. And they changed it to, okay, well, here's three. And so if you look at that, it's like, here's the line of actions for these heads, then you'll still have people say like, oh, like for an overhead press, that's all you need for a side delt standpoint. And I say, I can literally draw, like, let's take this plane and let's look at it. And I can show you, depending on how the person's structure for whatever we're going to call a side delt, like half of it's left out. Like it literally can't do anything. And then people are like, well, the study says, no, you can literally, from a physics standpoint, things on top of the axis can pull, things on the bottom can't. The research. And I was like, and people get mad if I like draw a picture, which I understand like has some inaccuracies. But I'm like, if you look at how they do these, like that's what they do is they make a really fancy picture. Like I literally have you see, I'm sure you've probably seen it in the Auckland stuff. They have like a circle, so they have this giant circle thing, and they chop off a cadaver arm. Like that giant circle is a really fancy. How do we determine and stay within exactly one plane of motion when we're talking about these things? And so it's like they've literally done this exact thing. It's one plane. They're fixing a plane because if you don't fix a plane, you can't talk about internal moment arms. And if you don't determine a line of action, you can't talk about it. So if you have three, just for all of delt, like I said, you could say an overhead press is everything for side delt. They just determined one line of action. They're basing it off of that. That's the stuff where I think if I find anything the most interesting about it, like I said, I think it's really neat and I like to nerd about it. But when I was like looking more into the methodology, because I'm sure you've seen it, there's like weird stuff that people will talk about. like that because I'm like, how the hell can that possibly be accurate? Then if you look at the methodology and how they determine some of that stuff, there's big discrepancies in there too. And I'm sure like there's a point too, which I'm sure you know about, is obviously like the size of muscles actually makes a massive difference too. Like you look at some of these studies and you actually read like who was this done on? And it's like it was done on 12 cadavers that were all an average age of like 86. Most of them are female. And it's like you will definitively see different things. And like if you imagine what the average glute slash adductor is at that point in time, like the whole time they're smashed like right like that. Like I joke, it's like got to be like two pieces of like beef jerky laying on top of each other. And it's like, so if we're going to talk about where those internal moment arms are for that person, like through these given ranges of motion, it's not the same as someone whose glute is like this big, at some point in
Mhm.
time as well too. And same thing with like delts. You'll read some of the stuff with delts. And you're like, well, how is this big of a discrepancy from this point to this point? And literally, if someone's delt is just like, well, we think of more like, kind of an internal, whatever you want to call it, like a rotator cuff or something that literally like lays flush on the bone. Like that's the 80-year-old. Like their delt is just pressed right against their bone, like right over the top of some of those more, deep things that we typically think about. And so it's like, well, you're going to see different things from someone like that. And obviously it's extreme, but if you got Phil Heath, like if you look where his internal moment arms for his delt, they're literally probably like 90 degrees angle different than, 80-year-old grandma or whatever. And that doesn't change a whole lot, I don't think, from like most like realistic like people like person to person. It's not like it's like I would say these like are making huge training differences, but some places it's certainly interesting. And so that's the thing, I guess, if I have a thing about all of it, aside from all of that, is like then too, is you have people where it's like if you want to talk physics at all, like you have to be able to like it's not to be like a dick, but you have to be able to like draw it. Like you have to understand basic physics, and people will rely entirely on, well, here's what the data says. And I was like, but this data is like physics based. It's not like a, something where we're like having like, hey, we theorize here's this underlying process and here's this whatever as opposed to outcome. It's literally physics. And the people that are conducting it obviously know this. But then like even read some of the studies that people talk about have nothing to do with hypertrophy. They're trying to figure out how do we like have a good outcome when we reattach stuff to people's bones and stuff after orthopedic things. And it's like they're not even I like that's half the question I'm gonna have with like Auckland. I was like, do you even know what like some people are like using your research for? And I can't
Mhm.
imagine that he does. He's like, oh wow, that's weird. But anyway, I'll whatever direct quote he has coming back from that, I'll be sure to let you know. If I would assume it's gonna be like, oh, that's weird. Although he's Australian, so I'll be like, oh, that's weird, mate, or something. I don't know.
I know he has some clue of what's going on because a friend of mine actually has had a conversation with him about the lat study, actually based off of some of the stuff that I posted about it.
Yeah.
So I've actually been meaning to reach out to follow up with him on that too. So he's just going to get all the meatheads
Hey, it's kind of
harassing
this is
him,
great. Just get
right?
some extra
Yeah.
consultation fees. Yeah.
Yep. So I think the neuromechanical matching thing, as a principle, it's definitely something I'm like, yes, this makes sense from a neurological standpoint, from a force standpoint, et cetera, in terms of the way that it does it. There is a decent amount of evidence that I can come up with, rationales, et cetera, to support it. What people are discussing and how they're using it is so far away from what would actually be a realistic application because they don't understand the limitations. So for example, just take let's just imagine that the data on the elbow flexors was perfect and
Mhm.
applied to literally every human being.
Yeah.
We simply don't have the ability in real time to manage resistance challenge that precisely. If we're going to talk about, all right, we're setting up a torque profile and then we're going to apply some momentum and have to deal with the inertia. We don't
Yeah.
have the ability of precision. We can make things generally very hard in one of the extremes, or we can make it relatively somewhat challenging through the whole range of motion. But we can't be like,
Yeah.
hey, I'm going to set this up so at 60 degrees, this is exactly where the peak resistance is going to be for this person.
Yeah.
And that's also not factoring in the actual relative tensile force of those muscles. So I think they're just assuming that they can take that torque data and apply it. And it's just not a realistic
Yeah.
expectation of what you can do with that information. And some of your content, you use the quote, physics don't lie.
Yeah.
And I've played on that and I'm like, yes, physics don't lie. It's like, but most people lie about physics and it's usually a lie of omission because
Yeah.
they're only covering a part of the story. We're only looking at, okay, we're looking at torque in a two-dimensional space, but all
Mhm.
of those muscles may have either multiple functions. So something might also be doing rotation in addition to flexion at a joint. It may have a force across another joint, etc. And if we're actually talking about true neuromechanical matching, we have to account for all of the forces. We can't just look at a profile in two dimensions because there's a specificity that plays into how the nervous system works. If you take like elbow flexion and you try and pronate while you curl, your bicep shuts off, even though, okay, no matter where we put this, it's still going to have some leverage. But basically, we're trying to do an opposite action.
Mm,
So that's an extreme example, but we can look at a lot of instances where if a muscle could have the best like torque profile in this, but because it has a also a torque profile in something that goes against the movement,
mhm.
we actually see less recruitment out of that. So for
Yeah.
instance, like a really wide incline press, etc., if you were to look at the lower pecs just as they were contributing to adduction,
Mhm.
like horizontal and not how much they're contributing here,
Mhm.
you would assume they would be more active than they are. And that's well, because if I'm in this position, those want to actually pull me here. So their contribution is limited by how much I can counteract that force
Yeah.
with something that's doing the abduction. So we can't take these two-dimensional things and put them there. And I think people just don't understand what's small piece of the puzzle
Mhm.
they actually have to actually apply this neuromechanical matching principle.
Yeah.
And in
No,
terms of the study, oh, go ahead.
no, you can go ahead.
I do think it's really funny when people criticize, like, you do drawings, I do drawings. I have a skeleton with a Deadpool mask. We call him Wade. And he's got basically, we've covered him in elastic bands. It's kind of just like a more detailed thing of what Tom does with the balloons and
Mhm.
stuff.
Yeah.
And people will be like, oh, these guys don't know what they're talking about. They just put strings on a skeleton. And I'm like, you realize these studies you're referencing, they're going to the insertion and they're
Yeah.
just putting a nylon
They're
string in
putting strings
there
on it.
and then they're measuring
And
that,
that's
right?
people say like it's the I'm sure it pisses you off. Like I hate to like there's almost nothing. Well, I never attempt to be condescending, but you have people that obviously the Dunning-Kruger effect so strong, and people just read study and they're like, well, there's a study on it, so they just try and slap you in the face with it. And I'm like literally, like that's why I said to people get upset about the two-dimensional drawings. And I'm like, everything you're looking at, they have gone to such greater extent than I will ever go to make sure this is two-dimensional. I was like, you literally can't say anything internal moment arm until you isolate a plane will always be that's like it's in the
Hmm.
definition. You first have to determine a plane, you have to determine the line of action, and then you can talk, and you have to determine a joint. Excuse me, I forgot that as well too. And then you can talk. So someone gets upset about that because I'm literally like, here's the joint of action, here's the plane we're looking at, which is actually convenient. We can look at it in two dimension. And then and I understand there is a case where it's like I'll say this is an estimate, but it's literally insane to me where people like that's the problem. If there's a million problems, or the huge problem with research is people get so like glorify it that they literally use like the most basics. Like we can't determine any muscle function without a study. It's like, are you serious? Like if I'm going to raise
Hmm.
my arm, like this before we had studies, I couldn't say that what's on top of the joint was doing it. We really didn't know if it was a delta or a lat. Like everybody else, just like all these meatheads that figured it out back in the day were like, oh, they just guessed and got lucky. Like, no, there is some basic physics that I don't need a study that if this is up here, like the thing that's on top is doing it. Arnold figured that out. People before Arnold figured it out. And there's nothing dumb about that. That is literally that should be the basis of them looking at this stuff and trying to figure some of it out. But there's a whole lot of, I'm sure you've like, this is the thing I'm actually really interested in asking Auckland about too, is like one you mentioned with like the pec is like you said, there's the thing where I did some different physics stuff. I hadn't done that before, where you look at I'm trying to remember the actual technical term because I looked up a lot of stuff. I try and actually look at mechanical physics or whatever. And I'm sure this is nothing new to you, but where you're looking at, we talked about like alignment, but you have things where it's like angular alignment or angular disalignment, where you have something like that, where you look at a pec and it's like, yeah, sure, yeah, we can talk about this plane, but exactly like you said, it's like you can look at something's contribution and you can calculate its ability to have an actual pull in that direction or not, and how much it actually is angularly not in plane with wherever you're trying to pull or
Hmm.
whatever you're using. And like you said, you get to a certain point where if someone hits like the point is 90, as I'm sure you know, you hit 90, it goes to zero. So when you're looking at certain things from a pec standpoint, where it's like, no, some of these are literally almost at 90, like it's going to go to zero. And obviously it gets less and less exponentially as you get closer to 90. But what other ones I thought were interesting too is looking at this is a hard one to find, at least for some of the Auckland studies, is where they don't always differentiate, at least from what I could find, the relative internal external rotation of like the
Hmm.
humerus, if we're talking about humerus stuff. And again, this is the thing where it's like, if you know anything about basic physics, that should be like the most massive, like, how the hell can you talk about this? If you don't like, that's the delt things are the perfect example. I'm sure you've heard people say, and this makes my head explode because I've heard smart people say, Like there's no difference between like what's the difference between an overhead press and a lateral raise? It's the exact same motion, exact same internal moment arms. And I was like, if you think it's the exact same internal moment arm, I mean, first off, you can't make that statement unless like here's the overhead press we're looking at and here's the lateral raise we're looking at. Like if there was no change in relative internal external rotation, then you can make that statement. We can talk about some other physics things that change there. But like for most people to say, oh, you don't need a lateral raise because it's the same internal moment arms. And I was like, maybe, but like that might not even be what was studied. I don't know if we can say that, obviously, if we're saying here's what it is for the delta, but we don't know the
Yeah.
internal, external rotation. And the same thing for pecs. I'm sure you've seen some people talk about like, oh, you have definitively better leverage on a fly compared to a press. And I was like, that for all practical standpoints, that might be accurate, but it still depends on the relative internal, external rotation of the humerus. Like if
Mhm.
someone is like, if this is my press and I change nothing about the humerus and I go to a fly, it's the exact same internal moment arms if I'm going through the same abduction, adduction. And people will say, like, oh, well, inherently, like, I honestly think people think that as soon as you straighten your elbow, like something's going to change at your glenohumeral joint from an internal moment arm standpoint. And if that doesn't just make your head hurt, that people think that, it's like you have no idea what internal moment arms, if you just think straightening your elbow changes the internal moment arms or the leverage, crossing your GH joint. Whereas, again, obviously, if most people press from like this and then they fly it like this, then yes, that's probably where that information comes from when you're looking at it. But if you don't have that context, it's another example of like you're just repeating nonsense out of context, and it may or may not be true for how someone's doing something.
There's a really old study that is a great way of discussing how fluid this stuff is. They looked at strength profiles for elbow flexors, and they looked at it male, female, and then male bodybuilders. And you can see that the strength profile changes relative to both sex and body size.
Hmm.
I think we can assume on average the male bicep was probably bigger than the untrained female bicep
Yeah.
in there, but you can see it literally the shape of the curves
Hmm.
changes relative to the size,
Hmm.
right? So when we're talking about applying this stuff, your internal moment arms that you have today, put on 20 pounds in a couple of years and they might be different,
Yeah.
even for the same person. And the rotational stuff at the shoulder, absolutely. I actually just did a post on this last week or the week before
Hmm.
because you've probably seen the same TikToks and whatever I have. People post like this one EMG and then they post like maybe a couple of internal moment arm graphs, right?
Hmm.
And of course, the internal moment arm graphs are not in the degree of rotation
Hmm.
that they're talking about. And
Yeah.
so I showed other studies that are actually more contextual
Yeah.
and then they totally disagree.
Yeah.
And if you get into this stuff, if you just look at studies that look at internal moment arms, which is not a hugely good use of your time,
Yeah.
but if you do it, you realize that there's not a lot of consistency. You'll
No.
look across studies and literally a muscle will be on the other side of an axis at
Yeah.
a certain point in one study versus the other. So this was a flexor at 10 degrees in this study, but it was an extensor at 10 degrees
Yeah.
in this study. And the fact that when you look at this, I think there was a systematic review in 2019 or something that included most of the Ackland papers. And I think it's like
Yeah.
Kluche or something is the
Yeah. I
other
think.
guy that does a lot of whatever. And basically that you just look at all the lines next to each other and you're like, okay. So in some of these, we can tell that the lines move in the same direction,
Yeah.
but we
And some of them.
definitely don't have the consistency to be able
No.
to be like, oh, we can really talk about this stuff at a nuanced level of bias in these things. You probably haven't ever seen like the stuff we do with something like OpenSim. So you were talking about the glutes. So with Brett Contreras, like I actually did a model for him built on top of like the one that he was using, where we were actually able to simulate a hypertrophy glute and
Hmm.
then look at because not only does that change the internal moment arms, what
Hmm.
it also changes how much the muscle would then stretch, right? Because greater moment arm, that muscle is also going to change in length more. So it also changes the amount of passive tension and
Hmm.
stuff that you would get in those lengthened positions and stuff, which then explains why even though the glutes are better leveraged than, say, the adductors, the hamstrings
Hmm.
in the short position, we're still significantly stronger in the lengthened position than the short position. But
Yeah.
if we look at a moment arm done on the traditional skeletal model with no tissue, that
Hmm.
you think the glutes basically lose all their leverage in the lengthened
Yeah.
position, kind
Yeah.
of like the people say with the lats. But I'm
Hmm.
like, you're assuming that the muscle can get parallel with the bone at that point, which doesn't
No.
happen.
It's funny. I did a whole video and I didn't do any like super fancy. I literally used someone with giant glutes and used that at the exact angle and was like basically drawing. Like it's because it's the same
Hmm.
thing, even though it's not as accurate. it's not too hard to draw and approximate, saying here's this person, here's where you can see this tissue from someone that's relatively lean and has massive glutes. And that's like in grandma, when the femur's flexed up that much, they're literally laying like that. It's like a piece of beef jerky on a piece of
Mhm.
beef jerky. You're like in an actual person with large glutes. But I always said too, like it's a good place to use that information for me anyway. I said, well, you could use a training argument that if you do have like, miss like this is why people that have big glutes, they can and should do everything, and especially a lot of long length stuff. But if you got like, Miss No Butt, Miss Jones coming in for the first time ever, that could be an argument for I'm going to do a lot more stuff that challenges the short because obviously maybe for her, when that is actually what her glutes like when they're pancake together, all that flex stuff, she might just pick up adductors like crazy. And so I'd say, well, for the individual, that'd be one of the interesting places where I'd say from a programming standpoint, and obviously Brett knows this is why because most people that are looking for his stuff aren't like the girls that are actually in his glute lab. Most people are like people like the same thing, like who actually researches bicep stuff. It's not Phil Heath. It's people that actually have no biceps. So for the average person, average woman, cruising his content that says I have no butt. I just found this guy and he promotes so many thrust things. It's like, well, that's probably really, really good advice for her because maybe just starting in a range of motion where she can maybe actually use her glutes more than stuff she might already be using is probably a good thing. You're braver than I am for putting some content out about like because that's half of it. When I debate putting content out, when people talk about like the pec thing or the delt thing, and I've put a little bit out about, but it's again not to be a jerk, but it's like one of those things where you actually challenge somebody's stuff on that, like you said, and they're just like, no, you say, oh, they literally like their knowledge base starts and ends with that study, where it's like, well, here's this. You say, well, no, if you actually look at this and read this, and when I try to explain that with people, like people is just like, no, most people are like, oh, you know what? I didn't actually read that study. I didn't really actually think about the mythology. I'm going to go rethink my life. Normally, it's someone obviously just gets like pissed off and says whatever. You're smaller than Ronnie Coleman, like shut up or whatever. And but yeah, that kind of stuff is just like you said, it's a lot of people looking at stuff they don't really have any business looking at. And like you said, that's like one of the worst things for me. And I don't look at most research for a lot of reasons because anytime someone wants to tell me something definitively, like most of the time when I go look, like that's exactly, I've looked a little bit more at internal moment arm stuff because again, it falls a little bit more in my realm of like I like the physics as opposed to like the physiology or chemistry or whatever. But so like every time I go look at it, then it's like this, I'm like reaffirmed this is exactly why I don't like look at this stuff because when I
Mhm.
look, here's the things that I thought I might find are the things that I find. And just, I thought this would be probably being someone using this so far out of context that they have no idea what they're actually using. Oh, and it turns out I'm right. But then it's like you can't even come back and try and like some of that stuff is like it shouldn't be complicated, but you realize again, people don't understand basic physics, so it turns into like you trying to tell somebody that like the simple thing of like this makes a big difference for training delts, how your shoulders rotated, but it's that just blows people's minds sometimes where they literally look at you like you're a crazy person.
I'm going to show this to you just because I think it's cool. So, for instance, this is the high-techy version of the drawing
Yeah.
on people thing that we use now, right? It's like
Mhm.
we have all the different segments of the lats from the ribs and whatnot. And what's cool about this is, in addition to calculating moment arms, we can look at changes in muscle length and stuff
Mhm.
as well. And I don't think it's super accurate, the data they have on here to be able to look at changes in sarcomere length and stuff. But in terms of
Yeah.
whole muscle length, it's cool because then basically it's okay. I can compare. So this model can do like lateral bending. So I
Mhm.
can compare like how this changes the length in the lat compared to basically doing spinal flexion extension
Yeah.
or doing it can even do like rotation in here. And this model, you see it's got like this big green like thing in here. So we
Mhm.
can actually simulate the structure. So like when we're doing rotation, we need trunk rotation, not arm. So it'll actually wrap around there to the
Mhm.
degree. So I can do this and then I can stretch him up over this way and that tissue like wraps around where
Yeah.
it's okay if I just had a string on a skeleton, it would like fall through.
Yeah.
When you get into this stuff, it's like, man, even with this type of a technology, we're still super limited. And again, you're going to have just like tons of individual variation. We can use these things to try and improve and be able to look at things like back in the day, the only way to get this data was somebody had to do it manually. And now we have these sim things where it's just like, cool, I can essentially do what I would be doing with my skeleton and the string on it.
Yeah.
But because it's on a software developed by Stanford, people will be like, okay, those digital strings I will trust,
Yeah. Yeah.
but your elastic strings I will not. But you're
Mhm.
still in this. I have an algorithm that's trying to figure out how much scapular rotation there is as you get to the top and all of those things, which is going to be different. And it's like you can only, sure, you can play around, you can change like the insertions a little bit to see how that, so you can get a lot of like principle based knowledge, but
Yeah.
it's still, I would say, to the degree that people want to apply this stuff, it's like even me taking it to this level, I can't confidently make half the conclusions that these people are making on
Yeah.
TikTok with
Yeah.
5% of the actual information.
Yeah, we can all. Well, it's the whole thing too with like a lot of stuff. We can all conclude that TikTok's the worst place on earth because like that's
Mm.
with all of this stuff. So two things that I'll piggyback off of, which you kind of mentioned, is one like some of the claims people make is like literally like the magnitude of the effect. Like that's where it's like even if I felt pretty confident, like hey, this is opposed to this, and again, that's where a lot of people like well they'll reference a study which shows like slight favoring to this over this. I was like if you want to say that, like fine. But then, like, what does that actually translate to? Like, again, I'm thinking, like, if I had a client, if I was training someone for like 3 months, for like a year, for like 3 years, like, how confidently could I guarantee this specific outcome over this? And I'm like, man, I mean, I don't know who the hell, and then it's
Hmm.
like one of those things for like most people, it's like, hey, if we really have a pretty good reason that like maybe you want to start doing this thing as opposed to more than that, then like have at it. And like that's the context of all this stuff is like make good decisions, but then like how big is the actual effect going to be? And a lot of stuff is like, I'm just not married to it because if it's like, okay, well, if we ever did have good data, whatever the hell that would look like to say, hey, this significantly did this as opposed to that, then I'm like, oh, great. Like, let's start doing that stuff a little bit more. But I don't know if you've seen, I have this one on YouTube. It's not anything like rocket science, but it's some like literally just for me, a visual way I thought of like putting something out where I have this thing called the circle rep principle, which again is nothing really overly revolutionary. But it's like my whole thing is like two things related to all this, and it does relate to the individual is like I feel like we have our industry has the most poorly defined base metric of everything that we talk about everywhere. Like again, it's like the base metric of everything is one rep because I'm sure you kind of like I'm sure you have to find it mildly entertaining or upsetting, like the way people go all in so much on like everything to do with volume and even everything to do with proximity to failure and everything to do with frequency and everything to do with how you set up your split. And I was like the difference of like how people do one rep from like person to person has like the most large exponential effect, in my opinion, on everything that comes after that, much more than all that stuff that we're like debating. And it's like if we don't establish that one thing well, like because that's how my brain works when we're talking about all these things, I just feel like, okay, well, let's how does this go out from here, from this one rep, and what does it look like
Hmm.
so much different from person to person? I actually came up with an analogy. I don't know, maybe whatever I felt kind of like it was a good comparable analogy, but it's like comparing like what's more important. We're talking about like the ingredients or the chef. And like right now, every single person is fixated entirely on the ingredients. And it's like, what's going to have the bigger outcome on the way that like something tastes? It's like I could give, an actual chef or me cooking something, and we're going to have two drastically different outcomes. On the same analogy, if you're trying to cook pizza and you have every single opposite ingredient, and all you've got is like seafood and shit, yeah, of course, like that's not great. But if we have all similar ingredients and then we have, again, how the person actually does them, performs them, executes them, or whatever, like the individual makes the bigger difference than the ingredients. And I feel like we have just like such a ingredients fixated industry now. And this is the perfect example. Like that's not even past just like we're talking sets and reps and exercise selection when people get into like internal moment arms and range of motion bias and all that. I'm like, holy shit. Like again, we're so far away from focus on like, the chef is probably your biggest thing that you want to focus on, how you're doing things. And again, we're not even getting into the arguably even more important stuff from this whole muscle building thing of just like adherence and like enjoyment and work ethic and things that are just like that's the same thing like you and I both know like how much of course genetics, of course drugs, everybody want to point at that, but like what level of results have you seen like just dumb meatheads produce based off of they like to work hard, they have great adherence, right? And then again,
Hmm.
obviously the huge issue with that is like then some of them they just take that so far to the extreme that all their joints are broken and they can't train past 10 years. Obviously not saying just taking a dump on everything that's more evidence based, but it really is like you get the super nerd that's like again all their stuff is from TikTok and they're like highlighting every study and they've probably got this like what's the thing you've seen? It's like the meme from like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I think it's like Charlie. He's got like this whole thing mapped out on his wall where it's like this
Oh, yeah.
insane. Yeah, like I feel like that's the average TikToker is probably weighs like 120 pounds and has that on his wall with like this perfect plan or
Mhm.
something and is still 120 pounds. So yeah, that's a little bit of a side rant, but yeah,
Yeah. On your ingredients analogy, I don't even think people are thinking about all the ingredients. I think they just pick one or two that they like and get
fixate.
on those things. Social media influences that a lot. All these things now run in trends. Okay, range of motion will be a thing, then volume, then
Yeah,
frequency. It's almost like we just do this cycle where it's okay, now we're going to talk about this thing like it's the most important thing and not the
yeah,
other thing because talking about all this stuff and hey, all of these things are important and you need to look at how they interact with each other and balance. Like that's too long of a story and it's too boring. And I think the same thing with like hard work and adherence. That's a story where it's okay. Occasionally we get into talking about those things, but you can. I think people want to be like, oh, here's a thing that I can talk about that is instantaneous. And I'm like, all right, this is now. Like adherence, Well, what's your evidence for adherence, especially if you're using yourself as an example? Like I can go out and show an exercise and talk about a change in physics like now, right?
Yeah.
I can't walk into the gym and be like, "Hey, here's the effect of adherence," unless I actually commit that time and actually show those results. So
Yeah.
that's not conducive unless you're the person that's already put in the work and
Yeah.
the consistency over time. And
Hmm.
so, especially for the younger generation, they have no time in the game.
Yeah.
So that's not going to be the thing that they want to talk about. It's like, hey, look,
Yeah.
I've been to the gym 16 times. Look at,
Yep. Well, and
and
that's
I
the whole thing
think,
too. You have educators that aren't, it's such a ever evolving different landscape than it was previously, where it's like how many people like literally never train somebody. I mean, that's the same frame. It's not even do these people lack their own body of evidence, but like obviously even more importantly, like a large group of people, like that's your whole thing when you're actually thinking about, okay, like all these people you've applied stuff to for all this period of time. And then that's when you really start to think about magnitude of the effect. And that's why, again, the good or bad is like it's hard to navigate social media when you actually have that stuff in your brain because you know as well as I do, like that's half the joke is like at just some point in time, like it's getting, I honestly feel like it's even like in the last couple of months, it just gets exponential. Like every single thing that comes on my feed is like someone's face on top of someone else's face talking about someone else's face behind them. So it's like, and you realize like, why do people do that? I mean, obviously it's the most base, emotions they just play on that people want to feel like, oh, if like this person's an idiot and this person's smart, I'm going to get on that tribe and feel good about them. So it's like tribalism and playing on emotions. But the other thing is like you have people that's like they don't have anything else to talk about, so they have to talk about somebody else's work. And I'm like, and
mhm.
this is like the direction we're going before, where it's like, and it's really easy to say, oh, look at this idiot does this thing, and this thing's great, and point it like just put a screenshot of a study, he's going to read for 2 seconds, and that content works so well. Where if it's like,
Yeah.
you and I try and create something where it's like, okay, well, let's talk about what we've seen, and let's put this in some context. And if it's not interesting, and you're not like dancing like a monkey and pointing at someone's face in the first 10 seconds, they've already scrolled past you, and they're like, oh,
Mhm.
I'd rather see somebody talk shit about somebody else. That's way more interesting. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
wild out there.
reaction and review content, like unfortunately, like the human psychologist, is that we will take something with more confidence if it's
Hmm.
presented as a way of showing somebody else is wrong,
Yeah.
even if it's the same information after the fact, or if it's a review or criticism of something. And it doesn't always have to be negative. Like even like your videos where you're like, okay, you're looking at Dorian's back
Yeah.
workout or whatever. If you were to present the same information, it's just, hey, here's some information about back training,
Yeah.
like the
Nobody would
engagement
care. Yeah.
level would be like, "Ugh."
Yeah.
And that's the unfortunate game that we have to play right now to compete for eyeballs. And you just, I mean, I try not to be overly critical, knowing that like basically everybody's trying to get their stuff seen,
Yeah.
but everybody draws their line somewhere on what is the ability or the degree to which I'm going to play this game
Yeah.
I find acceptable and ethical or whatever. So I'm not
Yeah.
like nobody can do reaction content. And I'm also like, well, you probably shouldn't be that person that is just like you find some random person working out
Yeah.
and you just trash their form or whatever.
Yeah.
I think if you review somebody's content or whatever that's in like the same space and you do it
Yeah.
respectfully, I actually think that's one of the best things that social media can provide. But people tend not to be able to tolerate
Yeah.
discourse.
Yeah, no, that's totally, I guess this is unfortunate because it's like my judgment that I'm using is the where you draw the line. Because I mean, of people that I follow, obviously, like, Brett Contreras is a perfect example. Like, he started doing a ton of this, but I think it comes from like he knows, like, I just have to do this. And then the stuff he does is just mostly presented in like a positive way, or if it's like
Mhm.
just a mild critique of, all right, well, and especially in his space, because you get the girls that like, here's how I got my butt, which is bands in my living room. And it's like, okay, well, this is good for me to tell females why you can't get a butt like that, which is bands in your living room or whatever. So yeah, it's definitely not like it's not an all bad thing, but there are like, you can honestly, it's not too tough for me to tell because you get people like Brett that have just been doing this his entire life basically and just trains people every single day and sees body every single day. And then someone that's literally like a 20-year-old that I joke it literally is in the category of like they have nothing to talk about. So all of their
Mhm.
content, every single video is they have to talk about somebody else. And if you're mildly clever and mildly patient with your, rehearsing, you can make things sound really convincing, like you said, in a
Mhm.
45-second period of time for someone that's not there to have a dialogue with you. Because like you said, I think in like presented, I mean, people do a podcast together or whatever, and I've seen plenty of people do it in a respectful way. But yeah, I think dialogue is the missing piece. If you can just have more dialogue about it, then that makes it a little bit more actually educational and beneficial, where it's not just someone shooting fish in a barrel for somebody that's not there to say, hey, wait a minute, let me explain this. And like you said,
Mhm.
then especially if it's like a normal person that's like, I don't know, this is what I do. Like they're not even saying anything. They're just like, hey, here's my workout. And then you're going to pick apart that person like all they said was this is my workout. They have met the claims that they're making, you know.
Hmm.
And yeah, but
Yeah. Actually, some of the most fun I've had is if there's been like a disagreement between me and somebody else on a topic, it almost motivates you to dig in on that a little bit more.
yeah.
And it's hard to change your mind on things if you don't have anything to prompt you to question it, right?
Hmm.
So it takes a lot of work and introspection to constantly be auditing your own ideas.
Yeah.
At a certain point, I know when I do so much, but what am I going to challenge out of my toolbox now, right?
Yeah.
Where if I open myself up to other people critiquing me or whatever, what's going to happen? Either if I'm being objective about it, I'm either going to learn something or I'm actually going to get better and more knowledgeable at my argument and articulating it. And this basically gives me an excuse to present my position. So to
Yeah.
me, this is a win-win if you look at this stuff objectively. But I just think a lot of people, that's not their motivation at all,
No.
especially the population you're talking about where they're just linking it. This is a model for getting views. They're
No.
not looking at it as, hey, this is a way where I'm actually improving the conversation or helping people. They've just seen that, hey, I can get more metrics on the social media algorithm by doing this type of content, whether it's actually valuable or not.
And that's some, and then some of it as well too. I always think it's like again, as long as we've been doing this, where it's like I just think some of it too is like I don't know. I mean, I maybe I sound like an old person now, where it's like there's just should be some degree of like respect in the industry as well too.
Hmm.
Like where it's like I think about coming up like even if there are points in time where it's like the people that were originally my idols, even if it was like bodybuilders, like when I'm just like a 16-year-old kid, like oh these bodybuilders they know everything, and as soon as I start to figure out maybe they don't know everything, I'm
Hmm.
still like respectful when I would like meet that person. Like I'd still like fangirl like the first time I met like Jay Cutler at a supplement shop or something or whatever. I'm like technically I'm like gonna like critique him. It's like no like just be positive and enjoy the things about that person that are enjoyable, and especially someone that's not making like specific claims or whatever, and just still present it in a respectful manner. Like I literally see it's like 20-year-olds are like coming up in the industry, and like you're going to come up by just like critiquing all these people that came before you that you're not even there to have a discussion with. And I'm just like, that's just not, in my opinion, not a fantastic thing to do. Whereas like most of the people, if I'm talking about their stuff sometimes, lots of times I've actually spoken to that individual about it or like created some context around it or whatever it is, or kind of want their opinion on it. It's not like something I'm just hoping nobody sees and don't tag people and be like, oh, here's this over here and whatever. So yeah, I guess it's the way people like their intent, and what they're the way they go about it is I think some of that's just lacking.
Good analogy for the environment right now is imagine back when you just started, when you were a year or two training,
Yeah.
imagine that you pulled like a Flex magazine off the rack or whatever, because that's what the stuff was. There was no
Yeah.
internets
Yeah.
back
Yeah.
then. Imagine that you were flipping through that and you read some things, and then you took that into the gym and you went over to the big guy at the gym and you like tapped him on the shoulder. Hey, you're doing that wrong. And you're like,
Yeah.
you pointed at this issue,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like that never happened and it wouldn't happen, but that's basically the equivalent of how people are behaving. One of the best examples is this kid that I've seen that I don't want to insult his physique or
Mhm.
lack thereof, I
Yeah.
guess. When you said there should be some respect, I'm like, yeah, even if you believed that you know better, do you actually think it's your place or a good idea that you should be like, hey, this is why Tom Platz's arms weren't as big as his legs because he
Yeah.
didn't follow these three things that I learned on Instagram. And I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's probably not content that you should make. That's probably not the way that you should go about articulating these ideas that you have. But they know
Yeah.
that I will get a ton of eyeballs if I take shots at those people. But I'm like, man, it just looks so bad coming from that level of
Yeah.
inexperience, and you're not going to get a positive reaction from anybody that has experience.
No. Yeah, and that's the thing I joke with people too. Nobody knows how long some of us have been doing what we've been doing and the way we're doing it. Like I tell people too, like I built my demographic at first before anybody knew anything. I was like, even in my gym floor, like I started, I'm sure probably the same way. But like right when I started, it was just like everyone, general population, just get bodies in front of you, as many people as you can possibly get. And so I'm like, all right, I'm going to learn how to do this business thing. I already knew that I liked the bodybuilding muscle thing, but I literally had in my brain, like I had so many people tell me you can't make money at that, so don't bother doing it. I literally told Carol, my wife, when I was 20, when she realizes I'm like a meathead with mental problems, and she's like, "Well, what do you want to do?" Like, I have an exercise. I'm like getting my exercise science degree, and I was like, if I had like my dream, I would like train like pro bodybuilders. And I was like, but Charles Glass is already doing that. Like that position is filled. Like no one else is doing that. That was literally in my brain. It's like he's the only person doing that. And then so when I started training, I was like, I just got to train normal people. And then like slowly after the first couple years, I was like, I just like bodybuilding and meathead stuff. So I used to like when I first started, I'd approach like literally like the biggest guys in my gym and like learn how to like because I would watch them and I'd be like, I don't really have great genetics, but I still know how to like put on muscle and progress. And I was like, I feel like I would help some of these guys that are just doing like some stuff is crazy. And so again, I had to learn how to approach these guys while I looked 50 pounds lighter than them. I'd be like, I would literally remember the first couple like giant guys I would train. I would have people stop me, kind of the same as happens now on social media when I'm training different people, but I had people be like, you're training that guy? And I'm like, shut up. He said I could, you know? And there's a whole thing you learn with all of that as well, too, where I learned how to approach these people in person without being a dick and without being offensive. And while it's saying it was literally like, oh, hey, can I have a discussion with this? And you find out real fast, too, where it's like, you think you can make everybody like giant and like whatever. And it's like, oh, I can help everybody. But, you know, you've got somebody that's like, you know, Tom Platz's legs were always going to be huge. Like if you're genetic elite for something, and if you're genetically like horrible for something else, like I can't make someone's lat insertions be like different. Like I can't make everyone's like lats look like Kai or whatever. Then you create that context in your brain as well too, where it's like I think I can provide benefit for everybody, but at the same time not making outlandish claims. Had I trained Tom Platz, his arms would have looked like Phil Heath's. It's like if you'd actually train people, you'd know that's not something that you could do, you know?
Mhm. We're almost out of time here. Maybe to stimulate some ideas for your conversation with Ackland
Mm,
and to touch on kind of one specific thing. If we look at the lats, I can't remember, this late 2021 or whatever, that's when the Ackland study made it on social media. And then all of a sudden everybody's, oh, yeah, you can't train them over 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, etc. Like my the points I usually bring up about this, and I can send you like my whole spiel on this if
mm,
you want to. One is like that actual study. I'm curious what you think, just like face value when you look at it and you look at basically not only the just the internal moment arms, but the difference between the ones in the frontal plane versus the sagittal plane,
mm.
and how basically in that study when they went to the sagittal plane, basically the moment arms dropped like substantially. When I saw that, like immediately I was like, what's going on here? So basically you have the lower lats here in this dark blue
Uh-huh.
in the sagittal plane, right? Doing shoulder extension.
Uh-huh.
And then in adduction, you have them down here in this red line. If we do our little, hey, let's attach the bands to the skeleton or whatever, the moment arm difference between the frontal and sagittal planes are they look very, very similar, and they definitely also have relatively a similar curve. And my I have a lot of speculations on why this may be. One may be like, how did they account for the rib cage? Also, they're just estimating the scapular motion, which is going to change the angles a little bit depending on how much elevation
Huh.
or whatever's going on. But then with a lot of these studies, what they also do is they're estimating where the axis is. And so if in the frontal plane, they estimate the axis to be like more medial because maybe they estimate it to be right on the fossa. So basically, it's like I'm gaining a little bit of length because I'm gaining half of the humeral head in length versus when I'm sideways. And then basically the axis is in the middle of the humeral socket. When I see those curves change so much, it makes me like, I don't know how I am in these results at face value because even with that little bit of change, they should have a relative similar curve. And
Yeah.
that's exactly what I find when we do sim models. And the other study, G or whatever it is that did it, they also found basically in the two different planes that the lats had essentially very similar moment arms in
Yeah.
frontal and set or in frontal and sagittal planes.
Yeah.
And that was actually like one of my things. And I'm like, okay, in addition to there just being like, all right, we're missing the soft tissue here, whatever. Like sometimes I see these and I'm like, I'm really curious of how that happened. Because at face value, I'm like, yeah, the relative profile, even though maybe the magnitude changes a little bit different if we
Yeah.
move that axis,
Yeah.
the curve should look very similar. It should only
Yeah.
change a few degrees on where that peak and stuff is.
Yeah.
And then the other thing when it comes to the lat training, that like separate from like this from the study now, but like just in general, when especially for like things like pull downs, is I don't know why, and I'm guilty of this too, is like we looked at lats as these are just their shoulder extensors, adduct. We look at them as glenohumeral joint and we isolate that.
Yeah.
If we're gonna say a primary joint for a muscle, is the one that it's going to basically contribute the greatest force. It's going to have the greatest internal moment arm.
Yeah.
The action for the lat at the sternoclavicular joint is 4 or 5 times
Hmm.
that of what it has. So if I'm up here,
Hmm.
let's say that we believe that the moment arm for the lats could go to 0 at the overhead. Just just if that even was possible, which I
Yeah.
think we both agree it's not. But the moment arm for the sternoclavicular joint is still huge
Hmm.
in that instance. When people are talking about pecs and lats, you can make a very strong argument that the sternoclavicular joint is that's the primary joint because the muscle has a significantly longer lever for that joint than it does for the glenohumeral joint,
Hmm.
no matter what position that you go in. And we can also take the ratio of those when we're looking at the muscles that are single joint versus two joint. So, for instance, like in a press versus a fly, in a fly, I'm lengthening the external molar at the shoulder, but
Hmm.
I'm also changing the ratio of the external molar of the shoulder versus the sternoclavicular joint,
Hmm.
which means, okay, like it's the muscles that basically only work around the shoulder joint, which would be the clavicular pec anterior delts, versus the muscles that actually move the sternoclavicular joint, which would be my sternal costal pec things or whatever. It's like I'm changing the ratio of how those things have been challenged, which probably is why we feel a much because if we think of well okay a dumbbell press should just be with a heavier weight should feel the same as a fly with the same
Hmm.
rotation if we look at the shoulder joint in isolation, but it
Hmm.
doesn't feel like that and we also don't move the same, and a
Hmm.
lot of that is because well if I'm changing the external moment arm ratio between those, well, that's going to mean that the scapular movement is going to be relatively different and things like that. A lot of times with this lat stuff, in addition to just us not having good data, it's like you guys are arguing about the wrong thing. Like we have so many shoulder extensors and adductors, the lats were never isolating or even the strongest thing for that. The teres major is has the same physiological cross sectional in research and
Hmm.
on humans. I know some people that have huge teres. I know some people that have huge lats. Like John Meadows is one of the ones where it's like his teres was
Yeah, huge
enormous,
theories.
right?
Yeah.
That muscle has a longer internal moment arm, and then you have the rear delts in there, etc. You have a lot of solutions for bringing the humerus towards the scapula. You don't have that many solutions for moving the sternoclavicular joint, especially with a long lever in those planes. So it's just like, have we gotten to the point where this is one of those ingredient things where it's like, I'm so focused on the moment arm of the lat as a shoulder extensor that I'm forgetting that actually when I do this elevation and depression,
Yeah.
that's actually the main action of the lat that I'm incorporating
Mhm.
in the pull down. And same thing, like it's chest is a lot harder for me to practically look at that because it's like, all right, how do I get in here and just do like protraction-y things, isolate that function? But with lats, it's super easy to
Mhm.
isolate just
Yeah.
depression or a high to low
Yeah.
retraction, which would
Mhm.
that would be like the range of function of the lats at that joint. As soon as we start going low to high, that's where then would be more rhomboids and traps doing clavicular action. So my message to people has largely been like, hey, even if you don't want to take my we'll say criticisms of the shoulder moment arms, right? You should at least understand that, hey, going up overhead, the lats don't lose leverage to do anything. They're still significantly loaded, just not at that joint, even if you
Mhm.
assume that there's no load at the for shoulder extension.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I guess you're just the only thing. I mean, I think the same thing. I just generally think of obviously the lat for what it does with the scapula. I guess I didn't really think about it from a sternoclavicular standpoint. But yeah,
Mm,
the same thing. I mean, obviously, if you do, that's all that scapular motion and its ability to move the scapula is. I
yeah.
mean, I've said the same thing just with that, with like what it's doing at the scapulothoracic joint. People get lost on that because like, well, only a certain percentage it attaches to the scapula. And I was like, it doesn't have to move the scapula. It doesn't have to be attached to the scapula to move the scapula. If it moves
Yeah.
the humerus is attached to the scapula will move. And that's the same thing. It's honestly in things that I've done. I've looked at again. Tom was some of the person actually showing me a lot of that as well too. Is again from the same thing your sim model does. If you actually do it with a person and actually measure the length change, literally using a tape measure, they can go right here and you can be like, okay, how much did the lat change? Okay, it changed. And then you can go here, how much lat length changed? And it's like generally the same amount. So how much length change
Mhm.
you can have just from like the GH joint, looking at what you've got
Yeah.
going on in there, and then how much you actually move from scapular elevation. It's literally like most of the time that I've tested it, not super fancily, is like the same length change. And so it's
Yep.
like most of the people, that's what I say the same thing. It's like, yes, I understand why you're gonna kind of want to run out here, but like that's different than just running out in that position because you want that
Hmm.
length change. That's significant, equally significant as it is to, again, what's happening just at the GH joint. But yeah, the same thing is like I don't ever think I even looked that close at the what you just showed me with when you're going through the different planes. And it's like, yeah, you're just everything's just again, all of it is just moving around your ribs. And like
Yeah.
the ribs again are just the anatomical pulley. And again, pulleys don't change anything from a force standpoint. It just redirects stuff. So it would make sense, logical sense to me is if we just went from here to here, everything would really stay the same. I don't
Yeah,
know why they.
it should look very
Yeah.
similar. So that's why I was like, that doesn't look right. Why are they so
Yeah.
different?
No,
Right.
I'll definitely
Hmm.
ask him that because I find that interesting for sure. And it's one of those things too where I get like, I think some people take decent information because then you get the people that do lat stuff where they're cranked as high as they can possibly get overhead. I'm
Hmm.
like, no one's really having a discussion about that, I don't think. And I do understand if you're doing like a legitimate pullover, we can have the discussions about like, yeah, where can maybe the pecs contribute more than other stuff. But like just getting in this pullover position and doing pure, again, we're doing the just GH joint motion, flexion extension, or if we're
Hmm.
getting like up here and doing this with something pulling that way as opposed to something pulling that way
Hmm.
are just like two completely different things. And but yeah, it's I don't know that this I'm still that whole discussion. Most of the lat stuff when I see people talking about it now, it just kind of makes me want to like just shake my head and I'm like, fine, just do whatever you want to do. Do your wide grip
Hmm.
stuff if you feel like that's the way to go. And I'm like, I'm still make such a good argument for this from a practicality standpoint as well too. Like
Yep.
that's half the reason people are like, why do you still do more of that stuff than the other stuff? And I was like, again, if it's a one or the other thing, I'm going to make an argument just for range of motion and muscle length change. But then two, I'm like, I can cue it better. I can find people's
Hmm.
lats better there. So I just tend to do more of that. I'm like, you can be fine out here, but if it's nothing
Yeah.
else, it's just going to be less range of motion.
Yeah. The muscle length stuff is cool because I've simmed a bunch of data on this stuff, like showing like how much muscle length there is, or how much muscle length change there is at the shoulder action. We can call it the scapulothoracic
Yeah.
action versus the trunk action. Basically, like for the most part, you have three ways to lengthen the lats. You can either move the trunk, you can move the
Yeah.
sternoclavicular joint, or you can move the glenohumeral joint.
Mhm.
And the glenohumeral joint is the smallest change
Yeah.
out of all of those, especially for the lower lats. When you get into the thoracic division, trunk motion really doesn't do much because when you're
Yeah.
rotating, it's very small. I'll leave you with this last thing that's if you want to know like the next evolution of research that's like kind of cool for this topic, it's called shear wave elastography.
I'm
But
gonna write that
basically
down.
what it is, using a high resolution ultrasound that
Hmm.
looks at the shear forces in the muscle.
Hmm.
So basically, when we go to a position, it can actually measure the actual stretch that's on the tissue
Yeah.
and within regions. So you can see if I rotate, does it stretch one region more
Hmm.
than another? So basically, it's a way of like actually verifying what we're like trying to do with the sim models and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And like the lat model, I think it's 2021 or whatever, was the first shear wave study on the lat positions. But basically, the trunk positions there matched exactly what we were modeling. And so that's cool. And I
Hmm.
think it might be one of the best proxies for hypertrophy in terms of something that's not a longitudinal study. Because if we're actually able to take a position or an exercise and
Yeah.
look at actually the shear forces on, because that's essentially tension, right?
Yeah.
At the tissue level, this is going to be cool. So rather than trying to like do all this stuff, I think if you want any type of research on your radar that kind of, we'll say either that confirms or correlates some of our ideas,
Yeah.
the shear wave stuff I think is pretty cool because it's okay. It tells us what's getting a stretch and kind of where that tension is.
Yeah.
And I think that's cool. I'll send you some stuff. I know you're not a
Mhm.
big research dude, but this is
Yeah.
pretty, it's like, hey, it's very practical. Hey, they did this position
Yeah.
and there was more shear in
Yeah,
this.
we didn't even get into it too, but that's why I tell people like there's some really smart people, which is why really dumb people shouldn't be looking at. But obviously, when we're talking internal moment arms, I mean, technically, I mean that's obviously half the equation for what do we produce externally. But technically, from a mechanistic standpoint, has nothing to do with anything. Like you said, it's literally if we take what matters is like everything that's bone to bone. Like that's if we're talking like intramuscular force, that's the half that actually, if there's chemical things happening that we want to have happening, it's in there. So you could have like this external appearance of whatever but that doesn't necessarily correlate with what's
Mhm.
actually occurring from the muscle standpoint. So that stuff is like that stuff I find very interesting because like that's the whole thing is people try and like extrapolate or figure out things and do estimates and all that
Mhm.
stuff. And I'm like, well, we're really talking about what's happening intramuscular is the most important thing. I don't think people really understand how, again, internal moment arms are technically completely exclusive of that. It's literally just a
Hmm.
distance measurement outside. It's a distance measurement. I literally think the way some people I've heard them talk about it, I feel like they treat it as if it's some like physiological property of a muscle. And I was like, it's literally a distance like measured outside of the muscle. It just explains the physics things out. It explains the outside of the body stuff. It doesn't have anything to do technically with what's going bone to bone and all the inner, like smaller stuff within that. Like you said, the sarcomere level. That would be super interesting for me to check out because that is obviously would be seemingly a more accurate, temperature tech of what's actually going on with what we concerned about the most.
Hmm. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Yeah,
You got a new project launching. If you want to give us a quick rundown of that so
yeah,
people learn more from you.
yeah. For anybody who doesn't know, I have the Hypertrophy Coach University, and I had a first level that was all business side. So for anybody that has struggled with the business side, that was what level one's been out for, I don't know, like a year and a half. And then the level two for me now is more of the mechanic side. And I've tried to have, if I have like a little niche, again, because I'm trying to, I wouldn't want to just have it be like, for me, everyone knows how close of a mentor Tom Purvis is for me to be like, just like, hey, this is like, I've taken RTS. Why would I go to this? Stemming from a compliment that Tom gave me saying that I see things well in the gym. A lot of it more is just, hey, if I'm in the gym and we're talking about these things, like, can I see it? And, I think I have it called like applied hypertrophy biomechanics. And that's kind of the idea is it's a little bit more applicable for the average person. If there's, like I said, the same thing we talked about in the beginning, not leading into this shameless plug, but was like if I, the way that I try and communicate things is probably a big of area of focus for me is even the things that I'm communicating now. If there's something that I try and get with that course more than anything else, is just people just obviously learn things different from different people. So hopefully trying to convey in a pretty usable, understandable manner.
Awesome.
But
All
take
right.
N1
Well,
too. So
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you give us a like, subscribe, and leave us a review, and we will see you on the next episode of the N1 Experience.